In late February 2026, the tense silence along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border was shattered in a matter of moments, ending months of uneasy calm and uncertainty. For years, this rugged frontier had been a flashpoint, but nothing compared to what was about to unfold. Pakistani fighter jets roared across the night sky, launching a series of targeted airstrikes deep inside Afghan territory. The thunder of explosions echoed through the valleys, signaling a new and dangerous phase in the region's long history of conflict. These strikes, focused on Nangarhar and Paktika provinces, marked a dramatic escalation. What had been simmering tensions now erupted into open conflict, with both sides bracing for what could become a prolonged and devastating war. Pakistan's defense minister, in a somber press conference, declared a state of open war with Afghanistan. This announcement ended any remaining pretense of border skirmishes or diplomatic restraint and signaled to the world that a new chapter of violence had begun. The world watched anxiously as two nuclear-armed neighbors edged ever closer to a wider war. The threat of escalation loomed large, with regional stability hanging by a thread and the possibility of catastrophe growing by the hour. Pakistan framed the strikes as acts of self-defense, targeting militant groups, especially the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, or TTP. Islamabad accused Kabul of sheltering these militants, fueling a narrative of justified retaliation and deepening mistrust between the two governments. The attacks were a direct response to a recent surge in deadly violence inside Pakistan, with officials blaming militants operating from Afghan soil for a wave of bombings and shootings that left dozens dead and many more wounded. As the conflict intensifies, the risk of a humanitarian crisis grows. Thousands of families are already fleeing their homes, seeking safety from the violence. Aid agencies warn of mass displacement, food shortages, and the rise of extremist groups eager to exploit the chaos. Trade routes vital to the economies of both countries could be disrupted, threatening livelihoods and regional commerce. There are growing fears that regional powers like Iran, China, and Central Asian states may be drawn in, turning a local conflict into a broader proxy war with unpredictable consequences. The stakes are global. Instability here could ignite new centers of terrorism, send shockwaves through international markets, and destabilize the entire region. The world's attention is now fixed on South Asia, hoping for restraint but fearing the worst. The world cannot afford to look away. The fires burning in Afghanistan threaten to spread far beyond its borders, with consequences that could be felt for generations to come. The roots of this crisis stretch back to the Durand Line, a colonial border drawn in 1893 that split the Pashtun people between Afghanistan and what would become Pakistan. Afghanistan has never recognized this border, fueling nationalist resentment and persistent disputes. The porous frontier has long been a haven for smugglers, refugees, and militants, complicating efforts at control. During the Soviet invasion, Pakistan became a base for the Afghan resistance, deepening ties with factions that would later form the Taliban. Hopes for a stable, friendly Afghanistan faded after the Taliban's 2021 return, as anti-Pakistan militants found sanctuary across the border. Ceasefires repeatedly collapsed, with both sides trading accusations over cross-border attacks and harboring militants. This cycle of mistrust and violence set the stage for the current explosive confrontation. The immediate trigger was a wave of deadly suicide bombings in Pakistan, attributed to the TTP and traced back to Afghan soil. The attacks targeted security forces and civilians, shaking public confidence and pushing Islamabad to the brink. Pakistan's government accused the Taliban of harboring militants and declared that diplomatic efforts had failed. The strikes were framed as a last resort to protect Pakistani citizens and restore deterrence. Recent diplomatic gestures, like Saudi-brokered prisoner releases, proved too little, too late for Pakistan's security establishment. The decision was made: force would replace negotiation. The message was clear: Pakistan would act unilaterally to defend itself. Before dawn, Pakistani jets struck 7 sites in Nangarhar and Paktika, targeting alleged TTP and ISKP camps. Islamabad insisted the operation was precise, aimed at militants, not the Afghan state. The strikes marked a major policy shift. Pakistan abandoned its strategy of indirect influence in Afghanistan for direct military action. By targeting both TTP and ISKP, Pakistan sought to justify its actions as part of the global fight against terrorism. The distinction between targeting militants and violating Afghan sovereignty was lost on Kabul, which saw the strikes as an act of war. This bold move was a calculated gamble to force the Taliban's hand and reassert control over its own security. The region braced for retaliation and further escalation. The Taliban's response was immediate and furious, condemning the strikes as a blatant violation of Afghan sovereignty. Taliban leaders warned of appropriate and measured retaliation, signaling a readiness to escalate if provoked further. The strikes shattered any remaining illusions of cooperation between Islamabad and Kabul, turning wary partners into open adversaries. The Taliban's rhetoric was defiant, insisting they would not be dictated to by Pakistan. Yet, a full-scale war would be devastating for Afghanistan, already mired in crisis. Both sides now faced a dangerous standoff, with neither willing to back down. As governments traded threats and accusations, it was the ordinary civilians who bore the brunt of the violence, caught in a conflict not of their making. Reports from Nangarhar and Paktika described entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble, families torn apart, and lives forever changed. At least 18 civilians killed, including women and children. Survivors recounted the terror of explosions in the night and the heartbreak of searching for loved ones in the debris. Pakistan claimed its airstrikes targeted militant camps with precision, but Afghan officials and local witnesses painted a different picture, one of civilian casualties, shattered homes, and schools left in ruins. The reality on the ground was far more chaotic and tragic than official statements suggested. The attacks triggered widespread panic, forcing families to flee their homes with only what they could carry. The sudden displacement deepened the humanitarian crisis in communities already devastated by years of conflict and instability. Markets closed, schools shuttered, and daily life ground to a halt as fear and uncertainty spread through towns and villages. The sense of normalcy vanished overnight, replaced by anxiety and loss. The conflict also worsened the plight of Afghan refugees in Pakistan, many of whom now faced the threat of deportation, harassment, or even violence. Families who had already fled war found themselves once again at risk, their futures uncertain. The human cost extended far beyond the bomb sites, affecting millions on both sides of the border. Displacement, trauma, and loss became daily realities for countless families. For ordinary people, this was not a geopolitical chess match. It was a fight for survival, a struggle to protect their children and hold on to hope amid chaos. The tragedy unfolding on the ground underscored the urgent need for de-escalation and a renewed commitment to peace before more lives are shattered in the crossfire. The conflict's shockwaves threaten the entire region. Iran and China, both bordering Afghanistan, fear instability could spill over and disrupt major economic projects like China's Belt and Road Initiative. A war would create a power vacuum, empowering groups like ISKP to expand and export terror. Both Pakistan and Afghanistan, already economically fragile, would face further collapse, with ordinary citizens suffering most. Western powers, reluctant to re-engage militarily, are left with few options beyond humanitarian aid and sanctions. The crisis exposes the strategic vacuum left by the West's withdrawal and the limits of outside influence. Regional actors may be forced to intervene diplomatically to prevent disaster. The world faces a stark choice: act now or risk a wider conflagration. Experts warn that Pakistan's recent strikes mark the failure of its decades-long strategy in Afghanistan, a strategy that once shaped the region's security landscape, but now appears to be unraveling. Islamabad once sought strategic depth by supporting the Taliban, hoping to secure its western border and influence Kabul. Today, however, Pakistan sees Afghanistan not as a buffer, but as a growing source of instability and threat. Afghan analysts highlight the Taliban's fierce defense of sovereignty and their refusal to hand over fellow militants, even when it means risking international isolation or economic hardship for ordinary Afghans. The ideological divide between the two governments runs deep, rooted in years of mistrust and conflicting visions for the region, making compromise elusive and dialogue fraught with suspicion. Regional powers like China and India are watching closely, each with their own interests and potential to fuel a wider proxy conflict. Their involvement could further complicate an already volatile situation. Humanitarian organizations warn that renewed fighting will make aid delivery nearly impossible, worsening hunger and displacement for millions who already face dire conditions. Borders could close, supply chains break down, and millions more could be uprooted, forced to leave their homes in search of safety and basic necessities. The international community must pressure both sides to de-escalate, not just for politics, but for the survival of millions who depend on stability and peace to rebuild their lives. The stakes are not just strategic, but deeply human. Every escalation means more families torn apart, more children facing hunger and uncertainty. The voices from the ground are clear. Escalation will only bring more suffering, and the world cannot afford to ignore their pleas for peace and stability. The Pakistani airstrikes and open war declaration have brought the region to its most dangerous moment in decades. Further escalation could trigger a humanitarian catastrophe, economic collapse, and a new wave of extremism. The crisis threatens to draw in regional powers and ignite a broader proxy war. Urgent diplomatic intervention is needed to halt the violence and reopen dialogue. The only real solution lies in addressing root causes, border disputes, militant sanctuaries, and mutual mistrust. For millions in Afghanistan and Pakistan, the stakes are existential. The world must act now to prevent the fires on this border from consuming the region.